In this tutorial, I'm going to talk to you about some polygons with special names, and those are called quadrilaterals. So a quadrilateral is a figure with four sides. Now down here are all the regular polygons that we already talked about, with the inclusion of the heptagon, which is 7 sides, and a nonagon, which is 9 sides. However, we're going to focus on quadrilaterals. So these are the quadrilaterals that we typically see. So the first one is called a parallelogram, and it kind of looks just like a rectangle that has some slanted sides. The next one is called a rhombus, which kind of looks like a slanted square. The next one is a square, which you're most likely familiar with. And then we have the rectangle. And finally we have a shape called a trapezoid. Now this is what they look like typically. However, each one of these can fit into more than one category, and each one has some extra rules to them that we're going to talk about next. So right now, the category that all of these shapes are fitting into are that they are all polygons, and right now they are all quadrilaterals. So I could call them by the name polygon. I could say that these are quadrilaterals, or I could call each one by its own special name. So when we look at quadrilaterals and polygons, the first subcategory that we're going to talk about is parallelograms. So down here at number 1, I'm going to explain what a parallelogram is, and then we'll talk about the examples. So a parallelogram is a quadrilateral with opposite sides that are parallel. Okay, so again, it's that the opposite sides are parallel. Now, if you're having trouble remembering what parallel means, if you come down in the word parallelogram and look, the L's in parallelogram form parallel lines. So the parallel lines are lines like those L's that will never touch each other. So if we come up and look at the shapes that are examples, in shape A, this shape is typically called a parallelogram. That's that slanted rectangle. The opposite sides on this shape are parallel. So the top side and the bottom side, and top and bottom are opposites, are parallel because they will never touch. They form two sets of parallel lines. The left side and the right side are also parallel. Those sides are opposites of each other because they're opposite of each other because left is opposite of right, and they form parallel lines because these lines that they form will never touch. So if we look at shape B, this is typically called a rectangle, and we could also though call the rectangle a parallelogram. The top side is parallel with the bottom, and the left side is parallel with the right. So this shape B, can now be called by many different names. It can be called a rectangle because it is a rectangle. It can be called a parallelogram because it has top and bottom opposite sides and left and right opposite sides that are parallel. And we can also call it a quadrilateral because it has 4 sides and it's a polygon. So shape C is very similar to A, just turned a little bit. Shape D we would normally call a square, and a square is a parallelogram because it has the top and the bottom sides parallel and the left and the right sides are parallel. So this we could call a square, we could call it a parallelogram, and we could also call it a quadrilateral. Now shape E is very similar to shape A, so we're going to leave that one go. Shape F down here at the bottom, this is not a parallelogram because if you look, it has some sides that if you continued them, the lines would intersect. So this is not a parallelogram. Shape G is called a trapezoid, and it would not be a parallelogram because these sides would intersect right here. Yes, the top and the bottom are parallel, however, all of the sides need to be parallel. Shape H I know is not a parallelogram because it is concave. Anytime you have a side that is concave, it cannot be a parallelogram. Shape I would not be a parallelogram because the top side and the bottom side would intersect if we continued them. And shape J, the opposite sides are parallel when you look at them. However, don't forget that parallelograms are quadrilaterals, and shape J is a hexagon. It has more than 4 sides, so it would not work. So what would we call these shapes down here that are not parallelograms? Well, shape F right here is a polygon because it's a flat figure. However, it's also 1, 2, 3, 4. It's a 4-sided shape, so I could call it a quadrilateral, but it doesn't have parallel sides, so I can't go any further and call it a parallelogram. So moving down, what's a rectangle and what other shapes are rectangles? Well, we typically think of a rectangle as this shape here, but rectangles actually follow some rules. So a rectangle, first of all, is a parallelogram. So parallelogram means opposite parallel sides. And so the opposite sides are parallel. And a rectangle is a parallelogram with all right angles. So when we look, we know that a rectangle is a parallelogram from the last screen. However, the reason that it is a rectangle is then it has these these right angles in it, the 90-degree angles. So each one of these is a rectangle because it's a parallelogram with 90-degree angles. So if we look at this, we would typically call this one a square. And it is. However, you can also call it a rectangle because it follows all of the rules of being a rectangle. It's first a parallelogram with opposite sides parallel. Top is parallel to the bottom, and the right is parallel to the left side, and it has all right angles. So it is also a rectangle. So if we look at a parallelogram, we said that was like a slanted rectangle. We can't call this a rectangle though, because these angles in here are not right angles. So we can only call it a parallelogram and not a rectangle. So that's what makes rectangles rectangles. If we look at squares and rhombuses, a square is this shape right here in yellow, which you're all familiar with seeing. So a square is just a rectangle with all equal length sides. And that's probably not the best way to say that. With all sides of equal length. We're going to write that. All sides of equal length. So remember, in order to be a rectangle, a square has to be a rectangle first, which means it has to be a parallelogram. It has to have the opposite sides parallel. A rectangle also has to have all 90-degree angles, which it does. And now the sides all have to have the same length. So if we were to measure this, we would have maybe something like 1-inch side, a 1-inch side, a 1-inch side, and a 1-inch side. So that's why a square is a square, because it has the 90-degree angles, the opposite sides parallel, and it also has sides of equal length. And that is true about each one of these. So, rhombuses. Now rhombuses are these little slanty squares that we see. So the rules for a rhombus are down here. A rhombus is a parallelogram, and remember that means the opposite sides are parallel, with all sides of equal length. So if you take a look at it, notice it says nothing about the angles. So it does not matter that these little angles in here are not 90 degrees like a square. All that has to be true to make a rhombus is that the opposite sides have to be parallel to make it a parallelogram, and all of the sides have to have an equal length. So if we were to look at this, we might say, okay, this would be 2 centimeters, 2 centimeters, this side measures 2 centimeters, and this side measures 2 centimeters. Now I don't know if that's true, but I'm just putting some numbers to it. Okay, so this one also looks kind of like a diamond, which is a rhombus, because all of the sides are equal in length. Now this is a square. So we call a square, first of all, but it can also be called a rhombus. Because it's a parallelogram with the opposite sides parallel, and also all of the sides are the same length. So a square can be called a rhombus, it can be called a square. Square is actually a very interesting quadrilateral because a square fits every single quadrilateral name for the most part. It can be called a rhombus, it can be called a square, it can be called a rectangle, it can be called a parallelogram, and it can be called a quadrilateral. Why? It's a quadrilateral because it has 4 sides. It is a parallelogram because the top and the bottom sides and the left and the right sides are parallel. It's a rectangle because it's a parallelogram with 90-degree angles. It's a square because it is a rectangle with all sides of equal length. And it's a rhombus because it happens to be a parallelogram with all sides that are equal length. So we could call this square by many different names. So when we look at these, we can use this information to label shapes with many, many different names, just like you or I have many different names.